Visa reported lackluster Q3 earnings after the bell, and investors were not happy. After being down 1% during the regular trade, shares of Visa are down over 3% in the after hours, taking us to an absolute critical level from a technical perspective. Can you step in and buy the dip on Visa? We'll discuss that in the context of the Q3 report, which came out after the bell. We'll discuss some larger macro discussions and policy that is impacting the upside potential for both Visa and MasterCard. We'll talk about some of the fees that they're able to implement, the $30 billion settlement, which is just more recently rejected by a judge. I went through the conference call over at Visa, and we'll go through the highlights. We'll go through all of the financial numbers, the balance sheet, the cash flows, and we'll come over here and look at this from a technical perspective. Folks, we are on the razor's edge. This stock is either going to find some footing at this level or it's going to be a lookout below moment. We'll talk about what the probable scenarios are for Visa. What is going on, investors? Hopefully guys are doing well out there. Visa, look, you stretch this out to a 5-year chart, 10-year chart. You're doing very well. Combine that with the dividend, the share buybacks, things have been pretty good. But year to date, you've been lagging in terms of performance at Visa. Just 1.7%, probably going to turn negative next trading day. And over the past 6 months, you are down. 1 month, you are down. It's not looking good for Visa. After the company reported their Q3 earnings, $9 billion in revenue, that was about 10% growth year over year, but it missed expectations by about $20 million. For the upcoming quarters, Visa management said things were maybe a little soft in the upcoming quarter. We just had a hurricane. I think it impacted parts of Texas. You had that cyber outage from CrowdStrike. You have other macro pressures as well. I'll show you those excuses that management went over on the conference call, talking about the first couple of weeks of July. So it could be that Q4 isn't very good. 11.5% is the analyst Wall Street estimates, but I think part of the reason why the stock is taking a tumble in the after hours is we're bringing into question the next couple of quarters for the company, at least from a revenue perspective. Now, other analysts out there, Bank of America in particular, said both Visa and MasterCard are cut to neutral as, look, over the past year, stock's basically been in neutral, and Bank of America is saying that the company has limited upside potential, pointing to extended caps for non-EU card purchases, essentially regulatory bodies around the world putting caps on the amount of price increases Visa and MasterCard can put into place, and the companies reached a $30 billion settlement, or at least they thought they did, here in the United States for those quote-unquote swipe fees, but that was rejected by a judge. So we moved to the conference call at Visa, and they said, look, the first couple of weeks in July are softer. You had the hurricane, you had the timing of Prime Day, which fell a little bit later this year in terms of the quarter, and also you have the CrowdStrike outage as well, drove down some payment volumes, and we'll see if the company is able to bounce back from this in the subsequent quarter. A lot of talk over at Visa about, quote, value-added services, or VAS. This has become a big conversation at Visa, and it's certainly the big growth driver going forward for Visa, because again, we're capping the amount you can raise your fees in the EU. We're going to have probably a capping similar here in the United States, so there's going to be limited upside based on what these companies are going to be able to generate from just your traditional swipe fees. So the company is pointing to its value-added services. These are different types of software. It could be a lounge in an airport, could be other types of payment transactions that the company is offering to its existing merchants. They're saying in 2021, they had about $5 billion in VAS. 2022, it grew $1 billion to $6 billion. In 2023, it grew to $7 billion just in Q3. They did $2.2 billion, which was 23% growth. So they're well on pace for north of $8 billion in value-added services for this year. That obviously can contribute to the company generating more and more revenue and diversifying away from just your traditional swipe fees that Visa has relied on. basically it's an entire history. Management noted that value-added services is tied to payment volume. So the more payment volume they tend to see, the more value-added services they're able to render. So in other words, payment volume starts to soften, so could VAS revenue growth. On the merchant settlement ruling, that was rejected by a court here in the United States, I believe in the great state of New York. Company disagrees with that ruling, but there's not a lot it can do. Says it's working on a new settlement. Visa says 20 trillion, that is with a T, 20 trillion in untapped payment processing opportunities. And they said rent payments here in the United States could be a growth driver for the company going forward. Morgan Stanley noted that a little bit of slowing in credit card usage rather than debit over the past couple of months. That's what Morgan Stanley has witnessed. In the past, that has been a little bit of an indication of consumer stress. So I don't think you can not believe that consumers are under stress these days based on the inflation rates that we've experienced over the past year and a half, 2 years. Visa pointed to the hurricane, the tech outage like they did earlier, and pointed really to a stable mix of debit versus credit going forward. On the share buyback side, the company had about $18.9 billion of remaining authorized funds for share repurchases as of June 30th, and the company repurchased 17.2 million shares at an average cost of $276 per share for about $4.8 billion in the quarter. So in the quarter, they bought back $4.8 billion in shares, and they have $18.9 billion remaining on their buyback. I'll remind you that shares of Visa are about $256 in the after hours, so the company paid about $20 more on average over the past quarter to buy back the shares. That can create some demand for shares going forward. We'll see if that materializes. Revenue, like we talked about, coming in at about $8.9 billion. That was about 10% growth year over year. Company's done a nice job. Like a lot of companies that we're following, look at your total operating expenses year over year from $3.1 billion down to 2.9. We'll call that $3 billion. Roughly flat, but it is down year over year from an operating expense perspective, despite higher revenues. Some of that has to do with the litigation provisions that fell in last year's quarter. Those didn't necessarily reoccur, at least dollar for dollar, in the most recent quarter. So your operating income is going to soar. 5.9 in the most recent quarter. It was $5 billion last year. From a balance sheet perspective, company has a ton of cash. So that is one operating lever that this company can pull. Some acquisitions, continue to invest in those quote value-added services. They could go out and acquire some growth if, again, those swipe fees are going to start getting capped by the regulatory bodies. Plenty of cash, some debt offsetting that, but nothing to be concerned about, because when you get down here to cash flows, we've got a 9-month view of cash flows. You pull down $14.4 billion in net income. A very consistent $13.3 billion flows down to operating cash flow. Last year was a little bit higher at about $13.8 billion, but they don't have, this isn't Tesla where they're having a big gigafactories or whatever. This isn't Google and Microsoft where they're having to build data centers and buy these GPUs and things like that. They don't really have to do this. Purchase of property, plant, and equipment, just under $1 billion in the most recent quarter. So again, that is one of the bullish notes about Visa, is they're going to be able to spend the vast majority of their operating cash flow, which I don't think anybody is thinking, even if you get a little bit of softening in the economy, things like that. Certainly if you go into a deep recession here in the United States and Europe, this stock, like basically every other stock, is just going to get absolutely hammered. But they've got plenty of operating cash flow to invest in these share repurchases. Again, about $11 billion over the past 9 months. Last year, it was about $8.4 billion, and then they pay those dividends as well. So they're just using basically all of their operating cash flow to pay for buybacks and dividends. So a very shareholder-friendly company. And if they can, I think, reaccelerate those value-added services, if the United States and Europe avoid some kind of deep recession that some people have been pointing to, well, you could continue to rebound. And speaking of a rebound, we're going to need a rebound in Visa shares ASAP. I'm seeing in the after hours, shares are trading about $256 per share. That's down 3.3% from where they closed the day at about $264 per share. I'm having to put a fake red candle in here to give you a simulation on what might happen at the open tomorrow when Visa begins to trade. We might put up a candle like this. And the problem with that is a couple of things. You guys know, from a technical perspective, I love these channels. Now with Visa, you could probably squeeze this thing into kind of a longer term channel, but more recently, really since December of 2022, we've been really making a series of higher highs, higher lows. We peaked out here in March of 2024, and it's really been ugly. Look at this black line. This is a 50-day moving average. When these things bend and they turn over like this, it's really not a good sign. You're waiting for them to kind of show signs of life. Tell you what, you put up a candle like this tomorrow, and this 50-day moving average is just going to continue to go lower. But depending on how you draw this bottom channel line in, some people might want to hug it up against here. Some people might give you leeway and try to touch the bottom of the channel. Either way you slice it, you are at the bottom of the channel or you're going to be slicing through it. Now, some of the problems is when you slice through channels, you like to find areas of support. There's a clear area of support for Visa at about $248 per share. It's not far from $256. So if you want to wake up tomorrow and buy Visa shares, certainly wouldn't blame anyone. I wouldn't put your whole account in it. We wouldn't do that with any stock, but let's assume you wanted 10 more shares of Visa or an opening 10 shares of Visa position. Probably buy 2 or 3 shares in the morning, because I tell you what, when you break trend, when you have no reversal of the 50-day moving average, you tend to want to find and kind of use these support levels as magnets. And so I think you're going to get an opportunity to buy this one $7, $8, $9 lower, with the potential for a $30 billion swipe fee settlement to actually go higher after the court rejected the initial one. That's probably going to be a little bit of a headwind. We're seeing the similar type things, although not from a settlement standpoint. In EU, yes, the value-added services continue to grow. They're on pace for about $8 billion, or maybe roughly about 25-30% of the company's revenues. Those aren't going to grow fast enough. And then obviously you have kind of an overhang potentially of a, quote, recession, or at least a slowdown in the economies here in the United States, potentially Europe as well. Could create, I'm not saying a crash in Visa stock any more than it's crashed from its highs up here at about 289. But again, very similar to what Bank of America said, is limited upside potential, at least in the shorter term. So I don't think you need to rush out and go buy Visa shares over any other stocks out there. This one certainly can be bought, though, at these levels. Technically should find some support. Little bit of a risk, though, that investors don't step in, although Visa with their buyback should be stepping in a major way over the next quarter or two. That will create some level of support with Visa. Folks, that was Visa's Q3 earnings. We'll be back some other time, some other place. Until then, good luck with your investments.